What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel. And I'm back with another thread video, and yeah, there's been some threads coming up and about that I am interested in, and this one, once again, I'm responding to imakaiya. I actually, just a little over a week ago, did a response to her album bands you should listen to based on your mood video, which I thought was really cool. This one, I really like the idea she came up with for this video, and that is a video about if you like one band, you'll like the other band. So basically, if you like this band, listen to that band. So basically, it's like a compare and contrast with metal bands in particular. So I have 20 bands total, 10 for if you like this band, and then 10 for you should check out this band. So basically, it's like we're trying to compare metal bands, like sound wise, or to find similarities to see if we can find common ground between some of these particular bands. So we're going to kick things off with Carcass. Of course, Carcass being one of the legends in extreme metal, being seen as pioneers of grindcore and death metal back in the 80s, and early on they were playing that more gore grind style on Reek of Putrefaction before starting to evolve more into straight up death metal on Symphonies of Sickness, and then Necroticism started to bring in some melodic death metal touches before pretty much solidifying that sound on Heartwork, and then going into the more melodic death and roll sound on Swan Song, and then their comeback run with Surgical Steel and Torn Arteries, back to that more necroticism and hard work type of sound where it's a little more heavy but still melodic and thrashy. But the band that, well, actually, before we get there, so Carcass, yeah, like I said, highly influential band, and there have been a lot of Carcass clones over the years, primarily in the Reek of Putrefaction phase of Carcass's career, but I'm decided to go with a band that kind of picks up more tropes from between Symphonies of Sickness, Necroticism, and Hardwork. I thought about going with Exhumed, but I decided to go with Impaled. And the reason I chose Impaled is because, well, Impaled doesn't quite get as much love as a band like Exhumed, especially when it comes to the Carcass clones. But Impaled, I've always found to be a very unique band. They're a little bit more punky in terms of like some of the rhythms they go for. It's kind of like grindy, but it's for the most part very much thrashy, like bordering on like classic death metal, melodic death metal, and thrash metal. So it's really kind of the perfect Carcass clone, in my opinion, for the later run in Carcass. And of course, what especially makes Impaled comparable to Carcass is in the vocals, particularly Sean McGrath, who's also the lead guitarist. He sounds exactly like Jeff Walker, which is uncanny how spot on, just how spot on Sean sounds like to Jeff. And also, of course, with Impaled albums like Mondo Medi-Cal and Death After Life, like those two albums in particular definitely harken back to like the early 90s Carcass sound, because the solos and the lead work on there is very melodic, very much in that Bill Steer, Michael Amott type of style. So yeah, if you like Carcass, you should definitely check out Impaled. They deserve more love. So next up, we're going to Cannibal Corpse. Of course, I just recently ranked all of Cannibal Corpse's albums in the discography ranking back in February, and it was tough ranking to go through because, well, Cannibal Corpse, not only the most famous death metal band in the world, but one of the best death metal bands of all time, basically helping to be one of the pioneers of like the real brutal, gory lyrics, along with Carcass and Autopsy and a few other bands. But they also helped kind of pioneer the use of triplet chugging in death metal, and also having the bass kind of stand on its own in terms of the mix, but playing along with the guitars. And then, I mean, again, Cannibal Corpse, super consistent. They have a sound, you know it's Cannibal Corpse when you hear it, and it's an awesome sound. But if you like Cannibal Corpse, you should check out Blood Red Throne. I've talked about this band ad nauseum on this channel over the past few years, and for good reason, because Blood Red Throne, very similar to Cannibal Corpse, one of the most consistent death metal bands in the world, and they're from Norway, and they're in a unique position because early on, you had Dodd and Short being the founding fathers of the band, and both had a black metal background. Well, as far as like how they came up through the ranks, both were live members of Satyricon. But Blood Red Throne have always had another type of sound to them. Like, they're very much in the vein of bands like Cannibal Corpse when it comes to the brutality and the chugging and the triplet chugs. But what I think does kind of separate Blood Red Throne from Cannibal Corpse a little bit is the more use of melody by Blood Red Throne, particularly in the lead work. But when it comes down to riffs, rhythms, chugs, and bass work, they're very much equal between Cannibal Corpse and Blood Red Throne. So, like I said, if you like Cannibal Corpse, check out my boys from Norway in Blood Red Throne. Next up, we're going to go big. We're going to go to my favorite band of all time, Metallica. So, Metallica, of course, arguably the metal band of metal bands, or at least one of the metal bands of metal bands, along with Sabbath, Priest, and Maiden. And basically, like, if you're gonna get into heavy metal, you gotta get into Metallica early on, same with the other three bands, to, like, really set you on the path to where you're gonna go. And of course, Metallica being one of the pioneers of thrash, and their 80s output, flawless. Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All. Flawless albums right there for thrash metal. And with subtle tweaks here and there, like Kill 'Em All, a little bit more punky, a little more raw. Ride the Lightning, they start to experiment a little bit more. Master of Puppets, they get faster, but also more melodic. And then And Justice for All, getting borderline technical and progressive at times. And then even their later work, like the last three albums, I will still say I think people underrate the shit out of the last three albums, because I think they're really good albums and showcase kind of like everything Metallica's done, from the thrash to the classic metal to the groovier side. But if I had to choose a band that for Metallica fans to check out, it would be Xentrix. Xentrix from England, they were a thrash metal band that started out kind of late in the thrash metal pantheon, like in the mid to late 80s. But I picked Xentrix because particularly the first two albums, Shattered Existence and For Whose Advantage, very much feel like Master of Puppets and Injustice for All combined, especially For Whose Advantage. Like, that album, some of those riffs feel like they could have been on those two albums, especially on tracks like the title track, Questions, False Ideals, The Bitter End. They're some fantastic songs. And even in the vocal approach, while a little bit different, there are some similarities in terms of the intonations within, and the what's the word I'm looking for? In the vocal phrasings, there's some similarities between the frontman of Xentrix back then and James Hetfield. And then, hell, even their later releases, like Seven Words, which came out a couple years ago, still has some Metallica in there. So if you are a big Metallica fan like me and want to explore bands that are heavily inspired by Metallica, look no further than Xentrix. Now, the next band I'm going to be talking about is Testament. Of course, Testament, one of my favorite thrash bands of all time, and very much similar to Metallica in the sense that they know how to riff out and make the guitars cry when it needs to. Of course, little heavier and a little more on the brutal side at times, but still retaining great melody. After all, the early albums, The Legacy and The New Order, are classics, and then even albums that have come out in recent times, like The Formation of Damnation, Dark Roots of the Earth, they get darker and more sinister and a little more brutal. But if I had to pick, so if you are a fan of Testament, and I could recommend a band similar to Testament, it would be Mesro. Mesro is a thrash band from Sweden that started out in the late 80s, and especially on the debut album, Then Came the Killing, heavy Testament vibes right away, especially even in the title track. Like, it feels like their version of Over the Wall. And then even in the riffs and the leads and just everything about that album just screams early Testament. And hell, even the guys at Mesro would not be offended by that. In fact, that was actually on the hype sticker for the recent reissues of that debut album. And then even their second album that came out last year, Summon Thy Demons, still has some Testament elements to it, but also lots of Metallica in there as well. I could have easily put Mesro as the band you should check out if you like Metallica as well, and Zentrix for Testament, because all four bands have so many similarities to each other that it could have been like interchangeable. But yeah, if you are a fan of Testament, check out Mesro. Alright, and then the next band I'm going to be talking about is one of my favorites, Opeth. In terms of progressive death metal or progressive metal in general, Opeth are the kings, in my personal opinion. Like, especially their old stuff from the 90s through the late 2000s, untouchable. Absolutely untouchable. And even when they get into the more prog rock side of their sound and on Damnation and even their later output, still really cool. But particularly the 90s through the late 2000s, again, flawless run, albums like My Arms, Your Hers, Still Life, Blackwater Park, Deliverance, Watershed, Ghost Reveries. Like, there's just some fantastic works during that era. And if I had to pick a band that, if you like Opeth and you want to check out a band similar, I would suggest In Mourning. And of course, In Mourning, also from Sweden, just like Opeth, and they are a progressive death metal band as well, but definitely more prog mellow death. And I would say the particular Opeth sound that In Mourning seems to chase after is the Ghost Reveries Watershed period, because especially on the last In Mourning album, The Bleeding Veil, the song Thornwalker in particular, lots of like Ghost Reveries era Opeth vibes in there, but even some Insomnium vibes in terms of like the more sorrowful sections, and whenever it gets faster into blast beats, it kind of harkens up a little bit of Insomnium. But in particular, when it comes to songwriting, song structuring, vocal approach, In Mourning definitely loves their Opeth. And who doesn't love Opeth? So again, if you love Opeth, you should definitely check out In Mourning. Alright, we're halfway through the list, so next up we're going to be talking about Behemoth. Of course, Behemoth, probably the biggest blackened death metal band in the world. After all, they've become world-renowned ever since the release of The Satanist 10 years ago, which still is maybe the best Behemoth album, and they keep trying to chase it now, and they shouldn't. But even before The Satanist, albums like Demigod, The Apostasy, Evangelion were killer albums in their own right. So, and I'm not really going to talk about the early black metal stuff, because while it's alright, that's not what I associate Behemoth as. Whereas what Behemoth became, starting with Pandemonic Incantations all the way to where we are now with the blackened death metal sound, granted, they've experimented more with like more atmospheric parts or more theatrical elements, or sometimes they can get just flat out brutal or just thrashy or technical at times. But if I had to choose a band to recommend to guys who like Behemoth, that would be Sulphur Aeon. Sulphur Aeon from Germany, they are another black and death metal band, and very much kind of picked up from where Behemoth left off in the last decade, like with The Satanist and Evangelion, kind of picked up the torch from where they left off and added in some elements of bands like Morbid Angel and Immolation and Nile and Garia and a few other bands here and there, and kind of mix it all together, but you still get heavy Behemoth vibes in terms of like how fast it gets and just how evil it sounds. Especially on like the last album, Seven Crowns and Seven Seals. Definitely lots of Behemoth vibes, but adding even more theatrics and some progressive elements on top. So it's almost like Sulphur Aeon has taken where Behemoth left off, but experimented more with it and evolved it by adding more of those proggy aspects to it, as well as some more clean vocals. But again, if you love Behemoth, definitely check out Sulphur Aeon. Next up, I'm going to be talking about another one of my favorites, Nile. Of course, Nile, when it comes down to brutal technical death metal, it's definitely a toss up between Nile and Suffocation for my favorite, but I think I give the edge to Nile just because there's more songwriting variety going on. And really, great discography for the most part, and one I'm probably going to have to rank in the future. More than likely next year, I'm going to be ranking Nile finally, and I've been wanting to rank Nile for a long time. But yeah, albums like Amongst the Catacombs of Nephron Ka, In Their Darkened Shrines, Ithyphallic, and Annihilation of the Wicked, like those are fantastic albums in their own right. Definitely finding that balance between Suffocation, Morbid Angel, and a few other bands that they kind of sprinkle in there, but played at hyper speed or at its slowest. And I would say a band that's a good companion to them that you guys should check out would be Hideous Divinity, which, of course, when I'm recording this, they're going to have a new album coming out next week, so, and I can't wait to check that out. But basically, Hideous Divinity is like the Italian Nile. They know how to balance brutality, technicality, melody, and just flat out amazing songwriting. So they basically know what they do in terms of like where to pick from influence wise with their songs. It's like, hey, can we add like this hyper blast beat here, or let's slow it down? And it feels very much like Nile in the sense of like it's so precise, but yet it's so brutal and chaotic, and I absolutely love it. So if you are a fan of Nile, check out Hideous Divinity. Next up, kind of going for a bit of low-hanging fruit with this, but I'm going to be talking about Time Ghoul. Of course, I already reviewed pretty much everything they did in the retro review I did a couple of years ago of their 2 demos, but yeah, early 90s death metal band from Missouri, and one that kind of ended right as they were getting started. You know, like I said, they had 2 demos, but they were hyper influential. Tumultuous Travelings and Panoramic Twilight. Very innovative for death metal at that time by adding in elements of prog, doom metal, and black metal all meshed together into one evil cosmic package. And even the death growls, like going back to Nile, the death growls sound straight up like Dallas Toller Wade's vocals. So I can kind of see where Nile got a little bit of influence from Time Ghoul, perhaps to some degree, vocally. But musically, it's like technical parts, but they know how to write some catchy doomy riffs or just some flat out slammy breakdowns at times that make me think of Suffocation. So, like, Time Ghoul kind of mixed Suffocation and Morbid Angel with doom metal, prog metal, and black metal to create their own brand of progressive technical death metal that feels very evil and dark. And of course, the band I'm picking, if you like Time Ghoul, you'll check out this band. It would have to be Blood Incantation. And of course, I feel like Blood Incantation's gotten more love, especially considering, you know, they've blown up over the past 5 years, pretty much ever since the last album, Hidden History of the Human Race, came out. I was like, holy shit, this band is going places. Like, bring in, of course, the elements of Time Ghoul, but also some Morbid Angel, some Immolation, some latter era death vibes. Pretty much kind of picking up the torch from where some of the classic death metal bands left off in terms of experimentation and expanding on it while retaining like that Time Ghoul spirit of just being cosmic and evil sounding. And of course, if you talk to the guys in Blood Incantation, they'll say Time Ghoul was arguably the biggest influence on why they wrote in the style that they write in. So if you love Time Ghoul, definitely love Blood Incantation, or vice versa. Alright, we're almost done, and next up we're going to be talking about Bloodbath. Of course, the legendary death metal supergroup out of Sweden started out with Michael Åkerfeldt of Opeth, Dan Swano of Edge of Sanity, and Jonas Rinsk and Anders Nystrom from Catatonia, just getting drunk together and playing some like Entombed worship and even some Florida death metal worship, and decide, you know what, why don't we mix both sounds, both scenes, into something that we can make of our own. And pretty much every album's been killer, and that's another band I'm probably going to rank next year because I fucking love Bloodbath, so why the hell not? But if I had to choose a band, like if you love Bloodbath, you'll definitely love this other band, that would be Wretched Fate. Very much, again, also from Sweden, but very much in the vein of Bloodbath, where it's, of course, that HM2 tone, but Wretched Fate experimenting with lots of groove, some doomy sections, and just some flat out mega fast rhythms, whether in the blast beats or these crazy, like, evil tremolo riffs that come along. Very much in the vein of Bloodbath. You know, both albums that they've had thus far have been amazing, especially Carnal Heresy that came out a couple of years ago. That was some awesome Bloodbath worship right there. So if you love Bloodbath and you want to find a band that's similar, look no further than Wretched Fate. And then finally, I'm finally going to bring up a black metal one, and that would be Immortal. And of course, I'm going to be ranking Immortal around Christmas this year, which seems fitting considering the winter time and such. But yeah, Immortal, one of the most consistent black metal bands of all time, even though recent years with legal disputes between Demonaz and Abath, yeah, can kind of ruin their rep a little bit, but musically they still know how to do it. Particularly Demonaz still knows how to write some great songs and play the guitar very well. But of course, like pretty much almost everything they've done, but particularly that late 90s, early 2000s run, you know, At the Heart of Winter and Sons of Northern Darkness in particular, just amazing Norwegian black metal albums that have some death metal tightness and some thrashiness to it. And if I had to think of a band, like if you love Immortal and you want to check out a band similar, I would say Shooter. Shooter, another black metal band from Norway, and another one that's super consistent with everything they've done. You know, starting off a little bit more on like the punky side of the Norwegian black metal scene before really evolving and adding in more thrash metal and death metal elements, especially on albums like Desert Northern Hell and Anti-Leave, and even the last one, Helvir, were just all fantastic albums. But especially Desert Northern Hell, that might be one of the best black metal albums I've ever heard. And it carries on some of the Immortal vibes of like that At the Heart of Winter era where it gets epic at times and melodic, but being really fast or really catchy. So again, if you love Immortal, definitely check out Shooter. And that, ladies and gentlemen, does it for this video. And this was fun, and again, Kaya, thank you for doing this one. This was a really interesting one to go through because, yeah, I talk about with a lot of reviews, like to compare to other bands just to kind of see it's like, oh, a good reference point. Like, you know, Blood Incantation, it's like, here, there's some Time Ghoul going on here, but also some Morbid Angel, and they kind of mesh all that together to create something of their own. So I could have probably brought up a bunch more because, of course, bands take influence from each other all the time, and it's always good to hear, like, the legacies of certain bands, especially even ones that broke up, carry on in the form of new bands, a la Time Ghoul breaking up and Blood Incantation kind of carrying on that legacy a little bit. But, of course, what are some bands that you love that you think, say, like, if you like so-and-so, you'll recommend this band, and so on and so forth. And hey, if you guys want to respond to this, be sure to tag imakaiya in the description box, because this is a fun discussion to bring up. But until next time, thank you for watching. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Keep your horns high, and your dreams wet.